SUA, I let the HOA pour their foundation on my ridge. The BLM held the mineral rights. How can both of those statements be true at the same time? What connection could possibly exist between a foundation on a ridge and mineral rights? Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I am so glad you are here for another unforgettable story. If you enjoy immersive storytelling packed with suspense, surprising turns, and satisfying moments of justice, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Your support means the world to us, and thank you for watching, sharing, and helping this amazing community continue to grow. Before we begin, leave a comment telling me where you are watching from anywhere in the world and what time it is where you are right now. Now, let us begin the story. Keep pouring, I whispered as the first concrete truck climbed my ridge. You are building far more than a foundation today. The engine echoed across the hillside long before the truck came into view, followed by the steady rattle of loose gravel beneath heavy tires. The sharp scent of fresh concrete drifted through the cool mountain air while the morning sun slowly climbed over the eastern horizon, painting the dry grass in shades of gold. I stood beside an old split-rail fence with my hands resting on the weathered wood, watching one truck after another crawl toward the freshly excavated building pad. Workers climbed out wearing bright safety vests, laughing as they prepared the concrete pumps. The long steel boom unfolded above the ridge like a mechanical arm reaching toward the sky. A few minutes later, wet concrete began flowing into wooden forms that stretched across the flattened ground. The sound was strangely hypnotic, a slow, continuous rush mixed with shouted measurements and the steady hum of diesel engines. Every few moments, another load arrived. Every few moments, another section of gray concrete disappeared beneath vibrating screeds and finishing tools. Most people would have rushed forward demanding someone stop the work. I reached into my truck instead, picked up my camera, and quietly pressed record. The timestamp appeared in the corner of the screen. That mattered more than anyone standing on the job site realized. One contractor noticed me filming and smiled politely before returning to his work. He probably assumed I was documenting the last day my family's ridge still looked familiar. He could not have been more mistaken. My name is Nathan Brooks. I am 39 years old, and my family has lived on this stretch of high country for nearly 80 years. My grandfather raised cattle here when the nearest paved highway was still under construction. My father planted cedar windbreaks across the ridge to slow winter storms and spent decades repairing fences that stretched farther than most visitors cared to walk. I inherited the ranch after he passed away, along with every sunrise, every weathered gate, every rocky trail, and every lesson he quietly taught without ever calling them lessons. From the highest point on the ridge, I could see miles of rolling hills fading into the distance. Hawks circled overhead almost every afternoon. Mule deer crossed the western pasture before dusk. After heavy rain, the smell of damp limestone mixed with cedar and sage until the entire hillside felt alive. To me, this ridge had never been empty land waiting for development. It carried the weight of generations. Linda Parker never saw any of that. As president of the Homeowners Association, she saw elevation, views, and premium real estate. She saw the perfect location for a new clubhouse overlooking the valley. She saw higher property values, elegant community events, and photographs that would attract future buyers. She believed the ridge belonged to whoever held the most recent construction plans. She believed enough paperwork could erase everything that came before it. As another concrete truck backed toward the forms and the pump operator guided fresh concrete into place, Linda waved confidently from beside the engineers, smiling as if the project had already become a success. She caught me watching and lifted one hand in a cheerful greeting. I returned the gesture with a small nod before aiming my camera toward the wet foundation. She thought she was watching the beginning of her greatest accomplishment. I knew I was recording the first layer of evidence. The ridge shaped every season of my life long before anyone imagined pouring concrete across its highest point. My earliest memories were tied to the sound of wind pushing through cedar branches instead of traffic or construction equipment. When I was 6 years old, my father would wake me before sunrise on cool autumn mornings, hand me an old enamel coffee mug filled with hot chocolate, and lead me up the narrow trail that climbed to the highest overlook on the ranch. We rarely spoke during those walks. He believed quiet places deserved quiet people. We would sit on a weathered limestone outcrop while the first sunlight rolled across the valley below, slowly revealing fences, grazing cattle, winding creeks, and distant mesas that stretched for miles across the horizon. He always carried rolled survey maps inside a worn leather tube strapped behind the truck seat. As a child, I thought every rancher traveled with maps. Sometimes he spread them across the hood of his pickup and traced faded lines with one rough finger while explaining where old property corners had been marked decades before. I never paid much attention. I was more interested in watching hawks riding warm air currents above the canyon than listening to discussions about surveys and legal boundaries. Looking back now, I wish I had listened more carefully. As I grew older, the ridge became my favorite place whenever life grew complicated. After high school, while many friends left for cities, I studied land management and eventually returned home because no office building could ever replace standing on that overlook at sunset. The ranch never made anyone rich, but it provided something far more valuable. Every season had its own rhythm. Spring painted the hillsides with bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush. Summer carried the dry scent of sun-warmed limestone mixed with cedar and sage. Fall brought crisp mornings where distant elk bugles occasionally echoed across neighboring public lands. Even winter possessed its own quiet beauty when frost covered the grass before disappearing beneath bright Texas sunshine. The ridge never felt empty. It simply asked people to slow down enough to notice it. My father understood that better than anyone. He repaired fences himself, maintained every stock pond, and refused shortcuts that might damage the land simply because they saved money. One evening, shortly before he retired, we stood beside the old windmill watching a thunderstorm build far beyond the western horizon. He handed me the same leather map tube I had seen since childhood. "One day," he said, "you will realize these papers matter just as much as the fences." I laughed because I thought he was exaggerating. Ranchers worry about drought, cattle prices, broken equipment, and wildfire. They do not usually worry about rolled maps collecting dust inside an old truck. After he passed away several years later, I placed the tube inside the storage room beside family photographs and tools I could not bring myself to throw away. I rarely opened it. Life stayed busy enough without digging through old paperwork. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder whether my father knew something I did not. Perhaps he understood that land tells two different stories. One is written on the surface where everyone can see fences, roads, and buildings. The other is hidden inside records, surveys, and agreements that quietly outlive generations. As another week of construction unfolded across my ridge, neighbors admired the growing foundation and congratulated Linda for finally turning an unused hillside into something useful. I simply watched fresh concrete cure beneath the afternoon sun and found myself remembering my father's voice more clearly than I had in years. Linda Parker possessed the rare talent of making every ambitious construction project sound like an act of generosity. She was 52 years old, impeccably dressed no matter the weather, and she treated every homeowners association meeting as though she were unveiling the future of the community, one carefully rehearsed sentence at a time. Before becoming president of the association, she had built a successful career selling luxury homes throughout Central Texas. She understood market values, presentation, and public perception better than almost anyone I had ever met. Unfortunately, she believed those skills applied equally well to land that had been shaped by generations long before subdivision boundaries existed. During monthly meetings at the community recreation hall, she presented polished architectural renderings showing a beautiful stone clubhouse perched on top of the ridge with wide terraces overlooking the valley below. Families would gather there for holiday celebrations. Wedding receptions could overlook spectacular sunsets. Residents would finally have a landmark worthy of the neighborhood's growing reputation. Every colorful rendering drew applause. Every projected property value increase earned approving nods from homeowners who understandably wanted their investments to appreciate. To them, the ridge represented unrealized potential. They saw an empty hill collecting weeds instead of a destination that could benefit everyone. Linda carefully reinforced that idea each time she spoke. She rarely referred to the ridge by name. Instead, she called it the Upper Development Parcel, reducing decades of family history into a simple planning label printed neatly on presentation boards. The first time she invited me to discuss the project privately, We stood beside the temporary survey stakes while a warm afternoon breeze carried the scent of dry cedar across the hillside. She greeted me with the same confident smile she offered every homeowner. "Nathan," she began, unfolding a large site plan across the hood of her sport utility vehicle. "Once this clubhouse is finished, people will wonder why this ridge sat unused for so many years." I studied the drawings without touching them. Parking areas stretched across the highest point. Walking paths curved towards scenic overlooks. Decorative stone walls framed the entrance. Everything looked impressive on paper. "You really believe this improves the land?" I finally said. She smiled wider, convinced she was winning me over. "I know it does. Progress always feels uncomfortable at first." Those words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Progress always feels uncomfortable. Perhaps sometimes it does. But there is a difference between improving something and simply covering it with concrete because it appears profitable. Linda never asked why my family had preserved that ridge for generations. She never wondered why certain areas remained untouched while neighboring ranches had changed repeatedly over the decades. Curiosity slowed projects down, and Linda measured success by how quickly construction moved forward. Within days, survey crews completed their work. Bright orange flags marked foundation corners. Utility contractors began staking future service lines. Concrete forms appeared where native grass had grown only weeks before. Every new delivery arrived exactly on schedule, and homeowners celebrated each visible milestone with photographs posted across neighborhood message boards. Meanwhile, I quietly photographed every survey marker, every equipment delivery, every permit posted near the entrance, and every fresh layer of concrete curing beneath the afternoon sun. Linda believed she was documenting remarkable progress for the association newsletter. I was documenting something entirely different, because while everyone else admired what was being built above the ground, I could not shake the feeling that the most important part of this ridge had always existed somewhere far below it. Construction settled into a relentless rhythm that almost made the impossible seem ordinary. Every morning before 7 o'clock, another line of ready-mix trucks climbed the winding access road, their engines echoing across the valley while workers prepared fresh sections of reinforcing steel and wooden forms. The smell of curing concrete gradually replaced the familiar scent of cedar and dry grass that had defined the ridge for as long as I could remember. Dust drifted across the hillside each afternoon, coating fence posts and sagebrush with a thin gray film that disappeared only after an occasional rain. Homeowners stopped along the roadside just to admire the progress. Children pointed toward the cranes lifting pallets of stone, while parents discussed how beautiful the finished clubhouse would look against the sunset. Linda rarely missed an opportunity to guide visitors around the project. Wearing spotless boots and carrying neatly rolled construction drawings beneath one arm, she moved confidently between contractors, answering questions as though every phase had unfolded exactly as she envisioned. She spoke about community growth, stronger property values, and creating a gathering place future generations would appreciate. People listened because the evidence stood right in front of them. Every day, another section of the structure became visible. Concrete walls cured. Structural beams arrived. Utility trenches stretched neatly across the building site before crews carefully buried them beneath compacted soil. The project looked efficient, organized, and successful. I continued following the same quiet routine that had begun on the first morning. Before leaving for work, I photographed the construction site from 3 fixed locations on my property. Every evening, I repeated those exact photographs from the same positions. I recorded delivery times, truck numbers visible from public roads, weather conditions, and every noticeable change across the ridge. My camera automatically preserved dates, locations, and timestamps. After dinner, I transferred every photograph onto 2 separate hard drives before placing one copy inside my father's old fire-resistant storage cabinet. Friends occasionally asked why I spent so much time documenting a project everyone believed was already decided. I simply smiled and changed the subject. Documentation is most valuable before people realize they need it. One Saturday morning, the association organized another neighborhood preview event. Folding tables covered with pastries and coffee overlooked the nearly completed foundation, while cheerful music played through portable speakers. Linda stood beneath a large rendering showing the finished clubhouse surrounded by landscaped walkways and decorative lighting. She noticed me standing quietly near the back of the gathering and invited everyone to applaud what she described as the beginning of a new chapter for the community. Several neighbors looked toward me, perhaps expecting another disagreement. Instead, I raised my coffee cup with a polite nod. "The foundation looks solid," I said. Linda laughed warmly. Exactly what I wanted to hear. The crowd laughed with her, believing I had finally accepted the inevitable. None of them realized I meant the concrete itself, not the assumptions beneath it. As the celebration continued, I walked a little farther down the ridge until the noise faded behind me. The breeze carried the faint scent of wet cement mixed with sun-warmed limestone, and beneath my boots I could still feel the same ground my grandfather had crossed decades earlier. I found myself remembering the old leather map tube resting inside my storage room, untouched since my father's passing. For reasons I could not fully explain, I decided that evening would finally be the time to open it. Sometimes the future changes because someone builds something new. Other times it changes because someone chooses to unfold a document that has been quietly waiting for years. That evening I carried the old leather map tube onto my dining room table with a feeling I could not quite explain. Dust covered the worn straps, and the brass buckle showed decades of scratches from riding behind my father's truck seat across countless ranch roads. I loosened the buckle, gently slid the rolled papers onto the table, and immediately recognized his careful handwriting across several faded labels. Some contained ordinary boundary surveys. Others showed grazing easements and water access records I had seen years before. Then I reached the final bundle wrapped in aging brown paper. Across the outside, my father had written only 4 words. "Never throw these away." I slowly unrolled the documents until the edges lay flat beneath the weight of 2 old field guides. The first map looked different from everything else. Instead of ranch boundaries, it displayed geological layers, mineral survey sections, and federal reference numbers extending beneath multiple neighboring properties, including my ridge. Attached behind it sat several official letters carrying the seal of the Bureau of Land Management. I leaned closer, reading line after line while the grandfather clock in the hallway quietly marked the passing minutes. My father had preserved correspondence dating back more than 30 years. There were survey plats, legal descriptions, historical lease references, and documentation explaining that the mineral estate beneath portions of the ridge had been reserved separately from the surface estate long before the subdivision ever existed. Additional pages referenced federal records, historical filings, and mapping updates that continued across multiple decades. I opened my laptop and began comparing the old reference numbers with publicly available land records. Parcel numbers matched. Survey coordinates aligned almost perfectly. Every search confirmed another piece of what the old documents suggested. The ridge everyone believed was defined only by fences and surface ownership carried another layer of legal history beneath it that very few people would ever think to examine. Suddenly, my father's words from years earlier echoed with remarkable clarity. He had never said the papers were valuable because they were old. He had said they mattered just as much as the fences. At the time, I thought he meant ordinary property records. Now I understood he had been protecting something much larger than family paperwork. Outside my kitchen window, I could still see construction lights glowing faintly across the ridge while workers prepared another section of the project for the following morning. They believed they were building upon ordinary private land. Linda certainly believed every approval she held told the complete story. Yet none of the construction drawings I had photographed, none of the neighborhood presentations, and none of the county planning documents had ever mentioned the historical mineral estate reflected inside the files now spread across my table. I spent the rest of the evening organizing everything chronologically. Every map received a protective sleeve. Every letter was scanned into digital form. I cross-referenced dates, survey numbers, and legal descriptions with my own photographs documenting each stage of construction. The growing folder became more than family history. It became a carefully assembled timeline connecting the past to everything unfolding outside my front window. By the time midnight arrived, I closed the final binder and looked once more toward the ridge. The fresh concrete resting beneath the floodlights no longer seemed like the end of the story. It looked like the moment 2 completely different histories were about to meet. The following morning, I drove into town carrying one weathered leather map tube, one carefully organized binder, and two portable hard drives containing every photograph I had taken since construction began. I did not stop at the county courthouse. I did not visit the homeowners association office. I did not call an attorney or schedule a meeting with Linda. Instead, I walked into the Regional Bureau of Land Management field office shortly after 8 o'clock and introduced myself to the receptionist. She asked how she could help, and I simply replied that I believed I possessed historical records connected to an active construction project involving a federally documented mineral estate. 10 minutes later, I found myself sitting across from a land law specialist named Daniel Mercer. He greeted me politely, expecting what was probably another routine property question. I placed the oldest survey map on the conference table without saying another word. His expression changed almost immediately. He adjusted the map beneath the overhead light, compared several faded reference numbers, and quietly asked where I had obtained the documents. I explained that they had belonged to my late father and had remained in our family for decades. I then laid out the entire timeline exactly as it had happened. I showed him photographs documenting the ridge before construction, the excavation process, the foundation work, every concrete delivery, and every stage of development. I presented copies of public meeting notices, county planning documents, contractor information, and every visible permit I had photographed from public access. Finally, I unrolled the remaining maps preserved inside the leather tube along with the historical correspondence bearing Bureau of Land Management letterheads from more than 30 years earlier. Daniel remained silent for several minutes while carefully examining each document. Occasionally, he entered reference numbers into his computer before comparing them with digital records stored inside the agency database. Another specialist quietly joined the meeting, followed a few minutes later by a survey coordinator carrying additional files. None of them rushed. None of them made dramatic statements. They simply continued comparing maps, legal descriptions, survey plats, and historical records with remarkable attention to detail. Eventually, Daniel leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. "Construction is currently active?" he asked. I nodded. The foundation was poured last week, and crews were preparing the next phase yesterday afternoon. He thanked me for preserving the documents and explained that mineral estates can remain legally separate from surface ownership under specific historical circumstances. He made no assumptions about anyone's intentions and avoided discussing possible outcomes before the review was complete. That professionalism impressed me more than anything else. Before leaving, I transferred digital copies of every photograph, scanned map, journal page, and construction record onto the agency's secure system. Daniel accepted the files and smiled slightly. "Most people arrive convinced they know the answer," he said. "You arrived with a complete timeline." During the drive home, I felt no excitement, no satisfaction, and certainly no desire for revenge. I simply remembered my father's habit of preserving every survey, every letter, and every receipt because he believed forgotten records often became important long after everyone else stopped thinking about them. Construction continued the next morning exactly as scheduled. Concrete crews measured forms, utility contractors unloaded equipment, and Linda walked confidently across the ridge, discussing future landscaping with the project manager. From a distance, nothing appeared different. Yet I knew something had quietly changed. The story was no longer being told only through construction drawings and association meetings. It now existed inside the hands of people whose responsibility was to understand every line written beneath the surface. And for the first time since the first truck climbed my ridge, I realized that patience had finally caught up with progress. 3 days passed without any visible change. Concrete crews continued arriving before sunrise. Pickup trucks lined the temporary access road, and the skeleton of the future clubhouse slowly climbed above the ridge. From a distance, everything looked perfectly normal. Linda continued greeting homeowners with the same confident smile, proudly describing the stone exterior, panoramic observation deck, and community gathering spaces that would soon overlook the valley. She carried rolled blueprints beneath one arm as if the project had already become a permanent landmark. Neighbors congratulated her almost every afternoon. Some even thanked her for transforming what they still called an unused hillside into something valuable. I listened politely whenever someone repeated those words. I had learned that correcting assumptions too early rarely changed anyone's mind. Facts simply needed enough time to arrive. Early Thursday morning, I stepped onto my porch expecting to hear another convoy of concrete trucks climbing the ridge. Instead, the air felt strangely quiet. The familiar growl of diesel engines never came. Only the wind moved through the cedar trees, carrying the clean scent of dry grass instead of fresh concrete. Curious, I drove toward the construction entrance. Before reaching the gate, I noticed every piece of heavy equipment sitting completely still. Excavators remained parked exactly where operators had left them the evening before. Forklifts stood motionless beside pallets of stone. Workers gathered in small groups drinking coffee instead of unloading tools. Something had interrupted the routine that had become almost predictable. Then I noticed several government vehicles parked beside the temporary field office. Their doors displayed official markings, and two survey crews slowly walked across the ridge carrying precision GPS equipment, tripods, and rolled maps. Another group carefully examined permanent survey monuments near the edge of the construction area while comparing coordinates against printed plats. No one appeared rushed. The atmosphere remained calm, professional, and remarkably quiet. Linda stood beside the project manager speaking with several officials. Even from 50 yards away, I could see that today's conversation looked very different from the enthusiastic presentations she usually delivered. Instead of pointing confidently toward future improvements, she listened while one specialist unfolded a large map across the hood of a government vehicle. Another official compared reference numbers printed along the margins before marking several locations with colored flags. Within an hour, contractors stopped preparing equipment and began securing the job site instead. Fresh caution signs appeared near the entrance. Concrete deliveries scheduled for that morning quietly turned around before reaching the ridge. Flatbed trailers that normally arrived carrying building materials now began loading and used equipment for removal. The project had not collapsed into chaos. It had simply stopped moving. News spread through the subdivision almost immediately. Homeowners gathered along sidewalks trying to understand why construction had suddenly paused. Some believed there had been a budget problem. Others guessed engineering concerns or permit revisions. A few speculated about supply shortages. I heard dozens of explanations during the next 2 days, yet none of them came close to the truth quietly unfolding inside official files. That afternoon, my phone rang. Daniel Mercer spoke with the same measured professionalism he had shown during our meeting. He thanked me once again for preserving such complete historical records and explained that multiple federal offices were now coordinating their review using both archived documentation and current survey information. He could not discuss conclusions while the review remained active, but he assured me that the historical mineral estate records had become an essential part of understanding the ridge's legal history. After ending the call, I walked to the highest overlook just as the evening sun settled across the valley. Below me, silent construction equipment cast long shadows over the unfinished foundation. For the first time since the first truck climbed the ridge, I realized the project was no longer being measured by how much had been built above the ground. It was now being measured by what had always existed beneath it. The pause that settled over the ridge lasted far longer than anyone expected. 1 week passed, then another, and the unfinished foundation remained exactly as the workers had left it. Rainwater collected inside open concrete forms while prairie grass slowly pushed through disturbed soil around the edges of the site. Without the constant sound of engines, I could once again hear meadowlarks greeting the morning and the steady wind moving across the limestone ridge. Nature has a remarkable way of reminding people that it does not measure time the same way construction schedules do. Linda continued attending association meetings, but the confidence that had once filled every presentation gradually gave way to carefully chosen words. Instead of announcing completion dates, she now spoke about ongoing reviews, cooperation with agencies, and the importance of allowing technical questions to be resolved properly. Homeowners who had celebrated every milestone now wanted answers that nobody seemed prepared to provide. At one meeting, a resident politely asked whether historical land records should have been examined before the project began. Another wondered why construction approvals had not revealed the issues currently under review. Linda remained composed, but I noticed something different. For the first time since the project started, she paused before answering nearly every question. The certainty that had once driven every decision had quietly disappeared. I stayed near the back of the room as usual. Several neighbors glanced toward me, perhaps expecting me to speak. I never did. There was no reason to embarrass anyone or turn a complicated legal review into a public argument. The documents were already doing that far more effectively than I ever could. During the following days, additional survey teams visited the ridge. They carefully examined boundary monuments, compared historical plats with modern digital mapping systems, and reviewed records dating back decades. Every visit looked almost identical. Trucks arrived quietly. Specialists carried equipment across the hillside. Measurements were recorded with precision, and conversations remained calm and professional. No dramatic confrontations occurred because none were necessary. The process relied on evidence rather than emotion. One afternoon, Daniel Mercer stopped by the ranch after completing another site inspection. We stood near the old fence overlooking the unfinished foundation while a cool breeze carried the scent of cedar through the valley. He could not discuss every detail of the ongoing review, but he thanked me again for preserving records that had allowed investigators to reconstruct the ridge's legal history with unusual accuracy. He smiled slightly before saying something my father would have appreciated. "Good documentation does not create the truth," he said. "It simply allows people to find it." After he left, I walked into the storage room and opened the old leather map tube one more time. The surveys no longer looked like forgotten pieces of paper. They looked like quiet conversations between generations. My grandfather had protected the land with fences and hard work. My father had protected its history with maps and records. Without either of them realizing it, they had prepared me for a situation none of us could have predicted. As the evening sun settled behind the distant hills, I stood beside the unfinished foundation and looked across the valley where golden light stretched for miles. The concrete remained exactly where it had been poured, but everything around it had changed. The ridge was no longer simply a construction site or a proposed clubhouse location. It had become a place where forgotten history quietly returned to the surface, proving that some of the strongest rights are not always visible from above, and that patience supported by careful records can reshape the future more completely than the loudest promises ever could. Nearly a month after the machinery fell silent, the first official conclusions finally began finding their way into the community through formal notices instead of neighborhood rumors. The language was careful, technical, and far less dramatic than the stories people had invented while waiting for answers. Historical records required additional legal review. Federal documentation needed to be reconciled with modern land records. Existing approvals would remain under evaluation until every jurisdiction completed its analysis. There were no accusations, no emotional statements, and no public spectacle. Just a methodical process driven by evidence that had existed long before any subdivision had been planned. The unfinished foundation remained exactly where it was, surrounded by temporary fencing that fluttered quietly in the afternoon breeze. Residents who had once stopped to admire daily progress now slowed their vehicles for an entirely different reason. They stared at the silent construction site, as if expecting movement that never came. One evening, the association scheduled another community meeting. Attendance filled nearly every chair inside the clubhouse conference room that was still serving as the temporary gathering space. Linda stood at the front with several board members beside her. She looked composed, although the confidence that once carried every presentation had softened into quiet professionalism. She explained that construction would remain suspended while additional legal questions concerning historical property records continued to be reviewed by the appropriate authorities. Someone asked whether the clubhouse would eventually be completed. Another wanted to know how much the delay might cost the association. Linda answered honestly that she simply did not know. That was the first time I had ever heard her admit uncertainty. When the meeting ended, several neighbors approached me in the parking lot. None of them wanted an argument. They were simply curious about why I had remained so calm from the beginning. I smiled and told them the same thing my father had taught me years earlier. Land remembers things that people forget. They looked puzzled at first, but after everything that had happened, the sentence seemed to stay with them. During the following week, Daniel Mercer called once again. His voice carried the same calm professionalism I had come to respect. He explained that the historical documents from my family's collection had successfully matched archived federal records, allowing investigators to verify information that might otherwise have remained buried inside forgotten filing systems. He thanked me not because I had challenged anyone, but because I had preserved history with enough care that it could still be understood decades later. After hanging up, I drove to the ridge just before sunset. The unfinished concrete reflected warm golden light across the hillside, while cedar trees cast long shadows over the quiet valley. I walked slowly along the same path where I had stood on the first morning watching concrete trucks climb toward the ridge. Back then, everyone believed they were witnessing the beginning of a new chapter. In reality, they had unknowingly uncovered the first page of a much older story. I reached the old fence line where my father had often stopped to look across the property, and I rested one hand against the weathered cedar post. The wood felt exactly the same as it had years before. So did the breeze moving across the ridge. Only my understanding had changed. The foundation sitting beneath the evening sky was no longer a symbol of defeat or victory. It had become proof that patience, careful records, and respect for history can quietly accomplish what arguments never could. Sometimes justice does not arrive with flashing lights or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it arrives carrying survey maps, faded letters, and the simple truth that the ground beneath our feet has a memory of its own.